Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We apologize for the technical difficulties, but we are very, very excited about the first session of this afternoon's portion of the symposium. And the first paper is entitled Washington Consensus Reforms and Lessons for Economic Performance in Sub-Saharan Africa. The authors are Belinda Archibong, Brahima Coulibaly, and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and the presenter is Belinda Archibong. Belinda, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction. Let me share my screen and just dive in because I know we're a little bit behind. So I'm going to keep my comments brief to like 10 minutes. And of course, you know, the paper is publicly available through the Journal of Economic Perspective, so please feel free to read and engage with the paper in detail for more detail past the 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So this is, we've had very, very nice previous presentations talking about the general perspectives on the Washington Consensus, and also talking about Latin America. And we wanted to focus on, you know, what has economic performance outcomes been for the reform adopters of Washington Consensus policies in Sub-Saharan Africa, and really look over the last 4 decades, right? So as was framed in the previous discussions throughout the 80s and the 90s, when these reforms are first adopted, you see a lot of decline in economic growth. And we said, okay, what happened afterwards in the 2000s, right? What happened to the countries that adopted these policies in kind of the decades since? Especially given a lot of the heated discussion recently around the kind of not just the legacy of these reforms, but also what they what they mean and what they imply for current economic development. So we're going to examine, or what we do in the paper is we examine reforms in 3 broad categories. So around domestic market-oriented reforms, focused on privatization especially, and fiscal reform, the second one focused around fiscal balance, and also trade openness between 1980 and 2019 in Sub-Saharan Africa. And just to give you a preview of the results, we find that economic performance in line with previous literature is worse for reform adopters in the 80s and the 90s. From 2000 to 2019, we then see this reversal, right? So we see this reversal where you see higher median per capita GDP growth for reformers over non-reformers in the post-2000 period. And this increase in economic growth is even higher for reformers, right? So you see economic growth in both categories, but we see higher economic growth for reform adopters. I will say that the analysis we're doing here is careful, descriptive work, but it is not causal, right? So we can think of many other reasons for why these reversals could be happening. And we'll talk about some of them briefly, or we talk about some of them briefly in the paper. Thinking about debt relief, for example, thinking about the increase in commodity prices or the so-called commodity super cycle of the 2000s, and how that kind of relates or affects the growth outcomes for reform adopters and non-reform adopters. And then lastly, we also do a very short case study looking at 3 countries. So 2 countries who adopted these reforms, Nigeria and Uganda, and then 1 non-reform country, Ethiopia, and you know, taking also the 2 of the largest countries in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria and Ethiopia by population, and trying to understand what their reform experience was and also what the outcomes were in terms of economic growth for these countries. And the lesson basically we want to take away from this, and if we take anything away from this very quick presentation, is to say that the experience of the reformers is heterogeneous, right? So yes, we do see this increase in economic growth for reformers over non-reformers in the post-2000 period. But crucially, what we want to emphasize is how the reforms were done. You know, if they played any part in increasing economic growth, which we are suggesting in the paper that it does, is really the important thing here, right? So that this focus and this shift in the post-2000 period of governments focusing on pro-poor policy and thinking about the socio-political environment and getting much more social and political capital and consensus and support for the reforms in the post-2000 periods. And crucially, again, this increase in this and focus on increasing spending, social spending on health and education was very, very necessary for reform success in the post-2000 period. All right, so now that I've told you the entire paper, we'll do the econ thing and go leisurely in our last 6 minutes through some of the evidence that we talk about in the paper. So just brief background, and I think we've covered this a bit already in the previous presentation, so I won't talk about this here in more detail. but giving you the context of why African countries were in the state they were in the 90s and 80s and 1990s with the debt crisis of the 1980s. So you have a lot of countries coming out of colonialism, right? European colonialism, and the ravages associated with European colonialism with the associated negative effects on economic development. And so you have a lot of countries, in Sub-Saharan Africa pursuing expansionary fiscal spending in the 60s and 70s, spending on health, spending on education, spending on infrastructure, that is trying to spur economic growth and economic development in these countries. When you add that to the fact that many of these countries were also commodity dependent, think of Nigeria, for example, which had discovered oil in 1959, and then got this boom from the increase in oil price in the 70s. You can see then why, or you can understand then why countries would have felt comfortable enough to borrow as much as they did from the international financial institutions over this kind of 60s, 70s period of expansionary fiscal spending, or just to help the fiscal spending. So then, you have the global recession in the 1980s, and this debt crisis becomes a very, very big, negative weight on many of the countries. And this is also the time when, again, we've mentioned John Williamson and the kind of Washington Consensus policies are being discussed. And he coins the term in 1989 on the Washington Consensus. And around these 10 market-oriented policies, which I won't go into too much detail here because it's been discussed a little bit in the previous presentations. But we really want to focus on these three key ones, right? Or these three big ones we thought encompass a lot of the other policies in these three broad categories, which is around fiscal discipline, around market-oriented domestic reforms like privatization, and around openness to trade liberalization, and interest rate liberalization as well. So in the 1980s and 1990s, you can see from this graph, right, this is median real GDP growth, per capita growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. You see this lower growth period in the 80s and 90s, and then you can see this reversal. This is what we're calling the reversal in the post-2000 period, right, where you see an increase in real GDP per capita growth in the post-2000 period in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So this is what we are kind of identifying as in trying to think about, like, what is spurring these reversals in the post-2000 period. Same thing happens with inflation, right? So relatively high inflation in the 1980s and 1990s, and you see this reversal with lower inflation in the post-2000 period. So, let me again talk about when we talk about reformers. I said there's three broad categories. So for us, for our purposes, we're going to do a very simple quantitative exercise to understand the growth outcomes or the growth rate outcomes of countries that were classified as reformers versus non-reformers based on these three broad categories, right? So using data from the World Bank and the IMF for about 48 Sub-Saharan African countries, we have, domestic, these three categorizations around domestic market-oriented reformers. So these are people who have a total cumulative number of privatization deals between 88 and 99 of greater than or equal to 6, which is the median for the region. And for trade openness, we're going to go with the Sachs-Warner definitions on countries that are classified around trade openness. So thinking about do you have less than negative tariff or average tariff rates of less than 40%? Do you have very little state involvement in terms of monopolies and state ownership of firms? So this is what we're going to consider when thinking about trade openness according to the Sachs-Warner definition. And then for fiscal reform, we're going to talk about, or we're going to define fiscal reform as having an average primary fiscal balance between 95 and 1999, which is greater than minus 0.7% of GDP, which was the median for the region as well. Okay, so again, apologies rushing through in the interest of time, but just to give you the kind of outline of the kind of countries that we have under the different types of reforms, or who adopted these different types of reforms. You can see many countries, or there are a few countries that are repeated, like Benin and Uganda, which is one of the key ones that stands out as being repeated in each of these reform categories, right? It has domestic market-oriented reforms, it has trade openness, it has fiscal reforms. In terms of the reforms, most countries, around 59% of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, adopt fiscal reforms. So fiscal reforms are the most popular category, followed by trade openness reforms, followed by domestic market-oriented reforms around privatization. And so this is one of the kind of big key results in the quantitative data that we show in the paper, right? So thinking about just in a very simple way, right, with the correlations, what has been the experience of economic growth in GDP, like looking at median per capita real GDP growth over the 1980 to 1999 period. So this is the period of reform, and in the post-2000 period for countries that adopt the reforms in each of the categories of reforms and versus the non-reformers, right? So across all countries, you do see in Sub-Saharan Africa an increase in economic growth, 1.4 percentage points between the 1980 to 1999 period and the post-2000 period. But what you find across each of the other categories that we're showing here is that the reformers, right, so the people who score highly on each of those reforms that I mentioned before, fiscal reforms, domestic market-oriented reforms, trade openness reforms, do seem to be doing better, right, in terms of GDP growth rates than the non-reformer category. They also start out, this is the previous literature, what the previous literature was showing. They start out in much worse straits, right, in the 1980 to 1999 period in terms of GDP growth rates than the non-reformer categories. And then you see this kind of stark reversals in the post-2000 period. Okay, so why is this happening? I'm going to skip over a lot of the discussion that we have thinking about the increase in commodity prices in the early 2000s, thinking about the kind of the conditions around debt relief. And I'm going to just go and highlight some of the case studies to understand what each of these countries or some of these countries were doing in the 80s period and in the post-2000 period, where we see this reversal for reform adopters, right? So the HIPC countries, this is the highly indebted poor countries. This is the countries with a lot of debt as classified by the World Bank. And then when we talk about commodity-dependent countries, we're also talking about countries that have greater than or equal to 80% of total merchandise exports from commodities. So I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. But just to show you, even when you consider countries that had a lot of debt relief versus countries that had less debt relief, or the non-debt relief countries, it does seem, again, that the reformers within the debt relief category seem to be doing much better in terms of GDP growth rates in the post-2000 period. Same thing with the commodity-dependent countries. The reformers seem to be doing much better relative to the non-reformers, even within the commodity-dependent category. Okay, so let me, in 2 minutes, tell you very briefly about Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Uganda. As I said, you have two of the largest countries in Africa and one country, Uganda, that's considered as a very highly successful reform adoption country, right? So Nigeria and Uganda are also the most populous countries in Africa. What do these countries do, right? So briefly, let me give you Nigeria and let me talk about Uganda, Ethiopia. So Nigeria in 1980s and 1990s, again, you see they're taking these loans. We talk about the structural adjustment program loans, conditional loans under the IMF and World Bank. You do see lower growth rates, right? So in the 1980s period in Nigeria, what reforms is Nigeria adopting? They're adopting domestic market-oriented reforms around privatization. They're also adopting fiscal reforms around fiscal tightening. They're also doing this while having very severe cuts in social spending on education and health, right? So this also then increases hostility towards these reforms. And we suggest in the paper seems to slow down any of the effectiveness of the reforms in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 2000s, you have a much more different environment. Nigeria has a transition to democracy in 1999 under President Obasanjo. One of our co-authors, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, is the finance minister, and they really try to focus on, again, going back to privatization and fiscal tightening, but fiscal tightening with an eye towards also increasing social spending on health and education, right? So Nigeria creates this excess crude oil account policy to build fiscal discipline that says essentially that when you have high oil prices, you're going to, or higher than expected average oil prices, you set aside the excess fiscal amount in a separate account called the excess crude oil account, and then you use that for social spending. Right? And so we see significant reversals in Nigeria's GDP growth rates. In Nigeria, I think is averaging something like 8% real GDP growth rate between 2003 and 2006, just to show again how the kind of reversals happen here. All right, so Uganda, I will just mention two things from Uganda and then Ethiopia. Uganda is one of those countries that's called a success story, right? In terms of it did all three reforms, and yet you didn't see as much increase in both GDP growth rates and also the translation of the increase in GDP growth rates into human capital investment. So investment in education, patient attainment, and health. And so there are many reasons for, discussing the literature for why this is. Again, I will skip over this in the interest of time. But one of the things that comes out is that Uganda is one of these highly indebted poor countries. And there's somewhat little or less kind of political and social capital behind the reforms, right? They're really doing these reforms mandated by the IMF on trade liberalization and reduction of export taxation in the agricultural sector, especially. And this seems to have an effect or a kind of effect in the way that the reforms are viewed internally by local politicians, and also the kind of drive towards trying to implement these reforms in the most efficient way as well. Ethiopia, a country that doesn't do any reforms, the government does have a lot of investment in terms of subsidies and in agriculture, and trying to shift away from low productivity agriculture towards services. And it's also a country that you've seen like significant economic growth as in the 2000s period, right? Real GDP growth rates of 8.9%. So a country that doesn't do any of the reforms, but still experiences increases in economic growth. So just to conclude again, can the Washington Consensus reforms claim a share of credit for growth in Sub-Saharan Africa after 2000? Potentially we say yes, this is descriptive evidence, again, not causal effects of the policies on economic performance, but yes, with caveats, right? So thinking very carefully around how the policies were implemented, the kind of role of social and political capital to implement these reforms was important in the success of the reforms. Looking at pro-poor spending around social spending around education and health, and a focus on that was also very important, also in encouraging support for the reforms and also increasing the effectiveness of the reforms. And also we again, heterogeneous experiences by many countries. There are countries that didn't implement any of these reforms, like Ethiopia, that still saw economic growth. And there are countries that did implement all of the reforms, like Uganda, but didn't see as much economic growth. So this is many caveats here, but very suggestive of the potential positive effect of the reforms in the post-2000 period on economic performance in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, I just got a message from our technical director that I've been promoted to be a panelist.
You've been promoted, Bill.
Thank you for the promotion.
You're welcome.
It's an honor to be promoted to be a panelist. So this is a wonderful contribution from Belinda. Really have enjoyed the paper that she did with Ibrahima Coulibaly and with Ngozi. Been a big fan of this paper already, and Belinda gave the main results here, which are very convincing. They seem to be a very important contribution to a growing literature, which we might call, oops, the Washington Consensus might have worked after all. After all the criticism, including from me and lots of others, that the Washington Consensus got over the years, now it looks like with data from the new millennium that reforming countries did actually pretty well. And we might see some long-run positive results after all. And Belinda's paper with her distinguished co-authors is a very important contribution to that, very convincing on that score. Also, Peter Henry has a very important paper contributing to that literature on the Baker hypothesis that I also found very convincing. That's more general for all emerging market and developing economies. And then I also found something similar in my own work also for this whole set of developing countries. And we can cite lots of others. We could maybe cite people who are not actually on the panel at the moment. There's a lot of work out there that is pointing to this conclusion. And it's great that Belinda and her co-authors have made such an important contribution to this. So having said all those nice things, just to make things interesting, I do have to register a little bit of disagreement with Belinda and her co-authors. And that's around the issue of how to interpret the 1980s and 1990s growth rates. So Belinda, I think you're saying that this is evidence that the early stage of response to reforms was not positive, that was actually negative. And I guess my disagreement on that is it really clear that reform had actually happened? Had any reform actually happened, especially in the 1980s, not much was happening. And not much was happening even in the early 1990s. It was really only in the later 1990s that reform was really starting to show, according to concrete objective measures of reforms like inflation rates and budget surpluses and black market premiums and all those things. The real change in policies was really sometime around the early to mid 1990s for most countries, among all developing countries, and for Africa in particular. And indeed, your graph, you show inflation peaked in 1994 and declined after that. And Peter has similar results in his paper on trade policy and inflation that it seems like the timing of the reform is really around the early 90s to mid 1990s. And so the negative results on 80s and 90s may really just be that reform had not happened yet, as opposed to reform was having a negative effect. And interestingly, where reform had been happening already, there actually was a pretty positive growth response. So one country that when I first joined the World Bank in 1985, my first World Bank trip was to Ghana. Ghana was in the midst of a major economic reform where Ghana had been severely penalizing the whole market economy, such that, for example, cocoa farmers in Ghana were only getting 6% of the world cocoa price. And Ghana had really effectively killed off the cocoa sector. And after lots of reforms on domestic prices and trade policy, cocoa exporters started to get a lot more, and the cocoa economy really recovered along with a lot of the rest of the Ghanaian economy. Similarly, Uganda that you mentioned seemed like a case of early reform after Museveni came to power in the early 1980s or mid 1980s. I'm a little puzzled, Belinda, that you said the growth response in Uganda was not very good to reform. The figures you showed, I think, were 4% per capita for Uganda in the 1990s and 6%, I think, was GDP growth, not per capita, in the new millennium. So according to my sort of scorekeeping, Ugandan growth was actually pretty good and shows a pretty good response to reforms. So I would continue to count that as a success story. So it seems like there really is some evidence that where reform was already happening in the 80s and 90s, there was some good growth response. But then when reform was not happening yet, yes, there were the negative results that you discussed for growth in Africa in those years. And so what was going on there? Why was there so much talk about structural adjustment lending by the World Bank and the IMF, about the imposition of the Washington Consensus? What was happening that there was so much talk about reform, and yet reform was not actually happening? And here is where you come in, and what is my favorite part of your paper, or my favorite point that you make in your paper, which is there really was a problem from the very beginning with the Washington Consensus with the word Washington. The problem with the Washington Consensus was the word Washington. Why was Washington imposing on Africa or on Latin America what Washington thought it should do? Why was there not kind of self-determination, national sovereignty, for democratic countries, some kind of democratic process of consultation for countries to determine their own reforms and not have them imposed from abroad? And I think you say convincingly, and as I can see correctly, that this imposition of reforms by Washington, by the World Bank and the IMF, generated a very negative reaction. And so one possible conclusion, which I don't think has been shown scientifically as yet, but it's something for further study, would be that maybe the attempt to impose reforms actually delayed the reforms. And they didn't actually happen until later because there was so much of a backlash against the attempted imposition of Washington on other countries' agendas. And as far as the supposed conditionality, the conditionality of the World Bank and the IMF, it seems like it succeeded in generating resentment, but did not actually often succeed in changing a policy. There was often difficulty enforcing the conditionality because the World Bank did want to continue lending to countries anyway, regardless if they're reformed or not, as a lot of researchers on the World Bank have pointed out. And so the World Bank, with its usual genius, achieved the worst of all possible worlds. It continued to lend to countries that were not under great conditions for the lending to be effective. It generated a lot of resentment by attempting to impose conditionality, but failed to achieve any real policy reform. And so it may have actually delayed the reform. Now, the good news is, thankfully, the longer run effect of all of this, as you have shown so convincingly, turned out to be more positive. So what happened around the time of the second half of the 90s and the early new millennium that might have changed the dynamics of reform? And I think your case study on Nigeria is a good hint at what might have changed, which is namely some local actors came along, finance ministers and presidents and prime ministers that really locally owned their own reforms, that decided to do reforms on their own. Of course, your co-author Ngozi is of course the outstanding example of that. It was really reform led by African economists and leaders that really finally turned things around and achieved good reforms, and then did have a good growth response. So the story so far has a pretty happy ending, which you have very convincingly shown in your research. So I guess the lessons from all this is that don't impose reforms from Washington is a big lesson that we might take away here. But when you do reforms, and I think part of why reform in this context does tend to work is that reforms in this case meant moving away from very extreme anti-production policies that, extremely high inflation, extremely high black market premiums were really killing off production and incentives for production. And when you do reforms away from those extremes, I think there is a more reliable response that you do get a positive growth response, as your findings are very consistent with that. So congratulations again on a great paper, and let me congratulate you on what you've achieved already in this paper.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much for your comments. Belinda, would you like to, I know Bill has to leave shortly, so Belinda, why don't you go ahead and share any thoughts you have with Bill's comments, please.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Bill, again. Very much appreciated. I think I'll just mention a couple of things on your comment about Uganda. I completely agree. I think it is a story of positive growth. I guess our point was that the positive growth doesn't seem to have translated into investments in public goods and human capital, right? And so this is what we, I guess maybe it's a perpetual story in many countries around the world where you see the growth rates, but it doesn't show up in education attainment, health infrastructure, all of these things. And so this is where the concern was with, is this a happy ending? And, yes, on the one hand with the growth rates, but on the other hand with the public goods and public services is a little bit of a concern. I completely agree with everything else, everything you said. So I have no more other comments on that. I think, reform led by African economists and having ownership of that, not imposed by Washington, was very important for local kind of take up of these programs. I mean, the statistic I like, and I didn't mention, but it's in the paper, is just looking at the civil service, like the share of civil service of civil servants in the overall population. And around that 90s period, it declined to 1% of the population, whereas in other developing countries, it's at 3%. And I think in the developed world, it's around 6 to 7%. And so you're basically decimating the part of the part of the government that's supposed to be implementing these reforms. And so it's a question of how are you supposed to implement the reforms when the local officials who were supposed to be doing that were all gone and demoralized because the kind of cut in public spending meant cutting civil service employment. Anyway, thank you. I very much appreciate the comments and completely agree.
So while we still have both Belinda and Bill on, I thought I would raise a question that one of the audience participants had submitted in advance and give both Belinda and Bill a chance to share any thoughts. So, and both have alluded to it already, but the question is from Ronaldo Fioravanti at the Inter-American Development Bank. And Ronaldo's question is, what role did political economy play in the implementation of policies in Sub-Saharan Africa? Either successfully or unsuccessfully.
Should I let Bill answer that?
Bill, you want to get your first shot since you've got to go?
You go, Belinda.
I mean, the short answer is a very large role, right? So this is, I think, going back to the point that we try and make in the paper and Bill mentioned in the discussion comments, around thinking about the politics of policy reform, which as economists, I think, okay, maybe let me speak for myself. In my graduate training, we're not primed to think about as much as we should be thinking about. And thinking about, again, this idea of when you have conditionality and when you don't have, when the kind of local politicians feel like they're getting these impositions from Washington for these policies. don't feel like you have local ownership. You have this demoralization that I mentioned before by decimating your civil service that's supposed to be implementing these reforms. So all of this, I think you can link this, and I'm sure we have another paper thinking about protests, but you can link this to the food price riots, for example, of the 80s and the 90s. This is like an expression of discontent around the politics of how these things were being imposed and on African nations in that kind of like 80s and 90s period, and I guess mostly the 90s period also, as Bill mentioned. And then, of course, one thing that is big, I think, that we try and highlight or allude to in the paper is this democratization movement that happens in the Nigeria gets democracy in 1999, and this wave of democratization that's happening in Africa in the 90s and 2000s period, that I think is very important, right? So for getting closer to this, thinking about local ownership of the policies and representation of citizens in their policymaking as well.
Bill?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you just said, Belinda. I think that the trend towards democratization is really an important political economy force that I think, when these sort of extreme anti-market policies were killing off economic growth, they under authoritarian regimes, they did benefit some insiders to the regimes that were collecting, the rents from extreme taxation on exports. So, for example, Ghana taxing the cocoa exports was good for some insiders in the regime to get sort of corrupt profits. But when the country becomes more democratic, then the insiders tend to lose out, and the population tends to vote for what's in their own interest, which is, of course, to have economic growth revive. So I think that's a really important point.
Bill, we thank you. I know you've got to leave shortly. We thank you for taking some time to be with us today.
Pleasure to be here with you guys.
For this paper. So Belinda and I will continue the discussion. But thank you, Bill, for coming.
Sure enough.
Thank you.
Belinda, I want to share another question that was posed ahead of time. And this question comes from Dino Morato at the World Bank. And the question is, how did policy reforms affect returns to capital and capital deepening in Sub-Saharan Africa? Any thoughts on that, Belinda?
So that's a good question. I think the experience probably differed by country. I will speak from the point of view of the country that I'm Nigerian. I know Nigeria somewhat well. So Nigeria, we notoriously are an oil export country. Something like 80 to 90% of export revenue comes from oil. And there has been a big push and it's an ongoing movement to try and privatize the oil sector, for example, right? And this is something that has been, something that's been an ongoing discussion, like thinking about what do we do with the NNPC, which is the National Petroleum Company. How do we encourage investment, private investment, when you have this one big aspect of the economy that is essentially, state-owned. So I think one of the things that Nigeria has done relatively well in thinking about how do you attract more capital and private capital, despite having this backdrop of this big oil economy, is trying to invest more in encouraging private investment in telecom, for example, telecommunication, and trying to figure out, what are some of productive industries and productive sectors in the country that are, that where you can attract more private capital, where you can see more, maybe, we talk about structural transformation a lot, more push towards investing or having government encouragement of structural transformation within the country, moving away from not just being just commodity dependent, but also having, a growing financial services sector and a growing telecom sector, which are areas that have attracted significant private investment over time because of government regulation, partly loosening barriers to entry to these sectors and making it more attractive for private investors. So essentially mixed evidence, I think, throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. But there is evidence, and I think that a big part of these reforms in the post-2000 period is through this thinking about privatization and attracting private capital in many countries by just changing the regulation to make the investing environment more attractive to not just international investors, but domestic investors and investors throughout the region as well.
think it's a very important point you make, Belinda. We're going to hear more about structural transformation from Mike Spence, I think, in the next session. But as you think about for instance, the Lewis model, one of the things that's often, I think, underappreciated about the dynamics of structural transformation, even as we know kind of the model of kind of intensive labor absorption into the manufacturing sector is challenged by this next stage of the Industrial Revolution. But if the returns to capital are not there for reasons that you and Bill were alluding to, whether it's high inflation, excessive taxation, excessive intervention, then there's no incentive for industrialists or capitalists to actually hire excess labor out of the excess labor pool. And so I think it's a very important incentive that wasn't, I think, not fully appreciated. That's really kind of implicit in the Lewis model. So good points. We think we've got time for one more question that was posed in advance, Belinda. So the question was raised by Gauranga Das from Hanyang University. And the question is, will AI and the fourth industrial revolution be as welcoming as the first and second industrial revolutions for Sub-Saharan Africa? In other words, are all these new technologies really going to be good for productivity and creativity in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you Peter, classic answer in economics. It depends. But I think this is where the "it depends" is very important because, again, it's one of those, we talk about structural transformation. I'm looking forward to Michael's presentation. We talk about, has the Industrial Revolution in terms of the switch from agriculture, right? This is like the Lewis model, where you go from agriculture to manufacturing. This is how you spur economic growth. Has it happened in Africa? And many people, researchers will say no. That actually we seem to have skipped over the manufacturing sector and gone straight to services, for example. And one of the things that I research is looking at online labor markets and matching through using ICT, information and communication technology, to solve unemployment issues, which are quite large in Africa, right? Africa is a very young population, 60% of the population under 25. And you have very high unemployment rates in many countries where, like, for example, Nigeria last year, it was like the unemployment rate for under 25s was something like 51%. So there's an increasing push towards the service industry and how to spur employment, especially, right? Key part of economic growth, thinking about human capital, how to spur employment using these new, online services, online technologies, smartphones, etc. So that said, I mean, we do have a situation where, this is great, this is fantastic. I think we have a very optimistic view of the future based on the fact that, again, in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think something like 60 to 80% of people who own a smartphone, can access the internet, and this is fantastic. But it will, again, depend on, can governments invest in infrastructure to make this access equitable? Can we integrate other sectors, right? I talked about the online labor markets. Right now, it's very, very high-skilled labor that seems to be accessing these online labor markets. So can we integrate these infrastructure, these online infrastructures with the labor market in such a way that it expands access to the vast majority of the populations in many of the countries which are poor, okay? So all of this will depend, again, on sensible policy, I think, re-government, and also the partnerships, efficient partnerships between the government sector and the private sector as well. So again, very optimistic, I think, I'm very optimistic for the future. I think given that we are in this situation where we seem to have skipped over manufacturing, we are in the services sector, and there's a lot of debate about how productive for labor is the services sector compared to manufacturing, potentially not so much. We really have to then think about, given that this is our circumstance, what types of partnerships between government and the private sector can happen to expand equitable access to the majority of the population that is, has access to these technologies and is online and using these technologies for everything from labor to consuming, consumer purchases, etc.
Belinda, thank you, and to you and your co-authors, Kulin and Gozi, for a very important paper. Thank you for a very insightful discussion, and thank you for your, I will call it, fact-based optimism.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.
We will end this particular session. And David, I want to turn the floor over to you, David Wessel.
Great. Thank you very much. That was an interesting discussion. These days, any discussion about the world economy that has even a glimmer of optimism is very encouraging. And so I appreciate that. And again, I want to apologize to our audience for the technical difficulties, but we'll try and get back on schedule. So in this session, we first have the great privilege of hearing from Mike Spence, who of course is a Nobel laureate and a professor at Stanford. And most relevant for this conversation today, Mike was asked by the World Bank to organize a blue ribbon panel of 22 people, the Commission on Growth and Development, to think through essentially some of the questions that we're discussing today. And he, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives piece, offers some thoughts on that. So Mike is going to make a presentation, and then we're going to have responses from Indira McGill, who's the chief economist at the World Bank, and Celestine Mongo, who is at various positions at Harvard. So with that, I invite Mike Spence to the virtual podium to present and share his screen.
I am now with you. Thank you, David. And good evening from Europe to all of you. We've heard so much really interesting, insightful commentary. It's a little hard to know, how to go about making my remarks. The paper's available, and they, as David said, they're a reflection of my own experiences interacting with Ngozi, among others, but many people who know a whole lot more by experience about economic growth and development. But I'd like to share some thoughts. So let me share my screen. I'll try to be relatively brief about this in order to leave lots of time for Celestine and Indermet to comment. So I got to go back up here. So I tried to ask myself a couple of questions, which is the subsequent, it was really the question that the Growth Commission was trying to ask. We had the benefit of, more than 15 years of experience in a wide range of countries on all continents to look at that, were simply not available to John Williamson and the people who were tackling the issues there. So I start my presentation with this slide. We do live in a very different world, and Peter and Belinda, talked a bit about some of those challenges, and I'll come back to them briefly at the end. But in this world, it seemed to me that this first cartoon, which is at last we've reached a consensus, there's nothing we agree on, seems to be a pretty appropriate description of where we are. So first comment is has to do with hindsight bias. So it's a well-known phenomenon, and it's, as I say on the slide, it's the common tendency for people to perceive past events as having been way more predictable than they actually were at the time. And the underlying idea here is that we're dealing with incredibly complex systems and their evolution. We can't rely on sort of equilibrium economics. There's huge amount of uncertainty at each point along the path. And so with the benefit of hindsight is really an enormously big qualification in reviewing historical experience. And it can be done with humility and a good deal of sympathy, but policy prescriptions, at least to some extent, I think everybody has said, are context specific. And as frequent bouts of macroeconomic stability were the order of the day in many parts of the world, it's completely natural to have a significant part of the focus of the reform agenda as outlined by John and others, focus on that. But it is not the whole development agenda. And John Williamson, with whom I had a chance to interact and learn in the course of doing the Growth Commission work, he understood that. And indeed, when you look at the Washington Consensus list, which you've already seen, so I'm not going to spend any time on this, there's not a whole lot that, at least from my point of view, that is missing from this, if you interpret it in the right way. So what is the Washington Consensus? What was it supposed to be, and what was it not? I interpret it as a very sensible, experience-based set of guidelines for things you need to think about in formulating context-specific development strategies in developing countries. And you can reasonably think of them as necessary conditions. I think there's near unanimity at this conference that achieving macroeconomic and monetary stability is a necessary condition. Its absence is literally fatal. And so there's essentially no disagreement about that. What it's not is a fully developed sort of set of prescriptions for growth strategy. Now, both Peter and Belinda mentioned, there are models of growth against which one normally, tests, the likely effects of policy prescriptions. And this is not, again, a criticism in any way of the Washington Consensus, but it doesn't talk about growth models. And what I've discovered over time is that people have a lot of different models in their head when they're getting to discuss about policy, and it's coming to be, in my mind, what I call the implicit growth model problem, which is, an inattention to the underlying assumptions about the way the economy works. It's how its dynamics really work, which I think could be usefully used to sort of resolve disagreement, including empirically based disagreements, on the relevance and importance of policy prescriptions. And finally, the Washington Consensus was not context specific. Any set of guidelines that's supposed to be useful across a broad range of territory, countries, even regions, is always going to have the problem that, it looks like a one size fits all thing. And again, that was not John's intention. So I think interpreting it as guidelines and not either a development model or a development strategy based on a set of policy prescriptions and an underlying model is probably the right way to think about it. I'll be very brief on this, but in the course of my work, I discovered that there were relatively, I'm going to make this too stark, but the question was, what are you trying to do? What's the objective function? And I found sometimes the objective function, while the words sounded like growth and development, most of the attention was focused on the policies. And the risk of, a set of objectives that really focus on policies is that you get trapped by various orthodoxies. And in an uncertain world, you may, sort of fail to understand how large the territory that you don't really understand is, and deal effectively with the problem of navigating with incomplete maps and dealing with uncertainty, probably do less experimentation. The alternative is to set goals and then admit that you don't really know how to get to them. And you may not make it all the way to them, but then you sort of muck around and experiment. So I think there's a bit of a challenge in being careful about not letting the policies become the objective. This may be controversial in the context even of today's discussion, but this is another problem that I think, I sort of encountered. And that's what I call the a la carte menu problem. Roughly speaking, picking the items on the menu that one likes and leaving out the rest of them, either because they're difficult or unnecessary, or even in the worst case, ideologically unpalatable. I guess that's fine for, going to a restaurant, but it's not so great for coherent development strategies. And a variant of that, sort of point is, you don't want to assume that if there's a list of 10 things and you do 4 of them, you get 40% of the hoped for results. I just don't think that's the way economics and reform policies really work. And you could debate, what fraction you get from solving some of these problems, but I think the empirical evidence that you get fairly high variance from samples taken where a subset of the reform agenda is performed, but not necessarily a relatively complete one. And that brings me to the point that's been discussed several times, and I agree with it, which is structural change is absolutely essential. part of the growth and development story. There's just no examples that I'm aware of in which you have sustained high growth, and there are lots of them in the developing world. I mean, it's been an extraordinary, on balance, success story, and all of them involve, very large amounts of structural change. And you have the Lewis model. I think Peter is right. That is an important set of insights about how this works, but it may be incomplete in the dimensions of sort of figuring out, well, what else do you need to stimulate this investment in the export sectors, and and what are the challenges of actually accessing the global economy? And you have an Institute for New Structural Economics started by Justin Lin to kind of shift a little bit the focus to this aspect of growth and development. There isn't much, partly because it isn't focused on models in the Washington Consensus about this. And again, I don't mean this as a criticism, but probably one of the messages I wanted to deliver tonight is that I think the models are really important, and debating whether they're accurate or in what context they're accurate, at what stages of growth they're accurate or misleading is an important step as part of the process of solving these very difficult problems. It's possible, it occurred to me, and I say this in the paper, that one of the models allocated all of the structural change to the private sector. And there may be still, significant differences of opinion on this, but for what it's worth, my opinion is that's a mistake. That is, that structural change is a combination of public sector policies and investments in collaboration with private sector incentives and dynamism that really accomplishes the structural change that is ideal. And you can't really effectively write either side of the equation out of the script too much. Having said that, I don't think there's one right development model. I mean, the sort of crude version of this is there may be lots of right answers, but there's bad answers as well. And what you want to do is land in the right answer range somehow. Subsequent development experience. I spent a little time on the paper in Asia, in part because the other papers were focused either on other parts of the world, the global economy and the developing world. There's nothing in the Asian experience that fundamentally calls into question anything in the Washington Consensus list. So I think that's the most important single thing to say. At the margin, there's some deviations. I think the Asian economies and growth stories had more than an insignificant, deviation from policies with respect to industrial policy and capital account management. Maybe that's context specific again. The risks of capture or levels of competence in government or the assets available to the state may have been different, but there are at the margin some noticeable deviations. But the one thing I did learn, especially from interacting with colleagues and experienced people in the Asian economies, is that they were appreciative of economic theory, but at the same time skeptical. And the reason they were skeptical is that both the market and regulatory institutions in a developing economy are in the process of development. And so a model which is used to predict the impact of policies that is based on an underlying presumption that the market and other institutions are fully developed needs to be dealt with a little bit skeptically. And so what you get instead is a slightly more tentative approach, but a kind of experimental approach to policy setting. Try this, we're not sure it's going to work. If it doesn't, stop doing it quickly. That sort of thing, that mindset, I think, has been an important element of the story. Just a couple other comments. One size fits all. The Washington Consensus, has been accused of that. I think this is just completely unfair. Any attempt to distill lessons from a range of development experiences in different countries is going to be subject to the same kind of criticism. The truth is that, as virtually everybody here has said, these guidelines that John and others have used to try to help in the formulation of development strategies, but the strategies themselves almost always, and not almost, always are context specific. They have to be respectful of the historical context, the political and social institutions. The pace and sequencing of policies is incredibly important in order to sustain the support for the policies. There's been numerous references to the political economy. I mean, I came to view this, political economy for sure, but after I sort of listened to my colleagues in the Growth Commission, I came to think of it as sort of an art rather than a science, but nevertheless, it's incredibly important. And the fact that, development strategies are context specific doesn't mean that there isn't really useful information from cross-country dynamic comparisons of experience. And one of the more encouraging developments in the past 3 decades, it seems to me, since the Washington Consensus was penned, is that the kind of silos, that I think were there, this continent's really different from that one. There's not much to learn from this one over that one. That seems to be fading away to good effect. If you were writing the Washington Consensus today, I think much of it would be the same, but there would be, I think, some important additions and probably some rebalancing of the emphasis. So I think there'd be more attention to connectivity to the global economy's demand and technology, the channels by which these connections are made and the technology moves around. Again, not a criticism, not totally missing from the Washington Consensus, but it's so important because you can't grow, as Penny said, on an autarkic basis. This is kind of, on a very short list, first order importance. Investment levels are required to sustain growth. I think, we've made some progress in understanding how high those have to be, even though they're high bars to clear. 25% of GDP, maybe 5 to 7% of that 25% going into public sector investment in tangible and intangible assets of a variety of kinds. It obviously changes with the development process. The middle income transition doesn't look like the first few decades of growth. And I think, over time, as many of the speakers have said, much more attention to the distributional aspects of the reform agendas is one of the main lessons of the experience since the Washington Consensus. Structural change, we've already talked about. I think urbanization, which is a parallel process, a kind of parallel enabling process, has probably surfaced as a very important point of attention in the development of these strategies. If it goes badly, or you get the wrong kind of urbanization, push versus pull, because of the absence of opportunities in the traditional sectors, you can get bad rather than good results. And let me just close by saying, it really is a different world, and it's been talked about that the digital transformations are a huge set of opportunities. There is a global explosion of entrepreneurial activity on every continent, not quite at the same pace, but it's there. It employs people, it generates, different growth patterns than we're used to. And I think Belinda covered, a fair amount of that, so I won't go on. But it is also a challenge to the traditional sources of comparative advantage for non-labor, for non-resource rich countries. And that is, the stark version of it, this is just Mike Spence speaking, I think it's a very good chance in 10 to 15 years, given the pace of development in a whole range of digital areas, that most manufacturing and much of logistics will simply not be labor intensive. And by that, I mean, the labor costs will be sufficiently insignificant that they will not be decisive with respect to where this economic activity is located. And similarly, we live in a world in which we, have a major energy transition. There is a life sciences revolution underway that may create imperfectly perceived opportunities right now. And we certainly live in a world that is prone to shocks we didn't expect before. I do not think in the rest of my lifetime we will see a global economy put together mainly driven by efficiency and comparative advantage. It's going to be driven by policies that push us to diversification, to resilience, to buffering from shocks. And these shocks come from all kinds of sources. Geopolitical tensions, climate has become a macroeconomic headwind, to put it mildly, in a way that wasn't talked about even maybe 5 years ago. And so I think this is a very different world. And so there's some really important creative work to do in rebalancing, and rethinking development strategies that are fit for purpose in the modern world. So David, let me stop there and do what I like to do best, which is listen to the people who are going to comment.
Great, thank you very much. That was provocative. Particularly your last two slides, which I think are the subject of the next conference. So let me recognize Indermit Gill for 5 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Celestine, and then we'll have time for a little bit of conversation before we come to a close at 3 o'clock.
So I really wouldn't have known what the Washington Consensus was actually, except for the coincidence that I taught a course at Georgetown in 2015. And that course was called The Big Debates in International Development, right? And I've taught that 5 more times since. So I'm teaching it right now at the Carte School of Public Policy that is in Hyderabad, India now. So this is the course that I teach. And you see over here, I have these 8 debates. One is on inequality, on climate change, the Arab Spring, and so on. And some of these things have changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. But the one thing that I have not changed is the debate that I locate in Latin America, which is the Washington Consensus, right? So as I prepared for this course, I actually started to understand what John was trying to do when he came up with these things, right? These are the same things that Mike just showed you about, fiscal balance, government spending, tax effort, and so on. And they are very, very sensible things. And actually, if you read the way that John writes, they're even more sensible than they look on this slide. They're very, very sensible. And essentially, he put together this list because he said this was what he thought people in Washington, especially the US Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, and the think tanks, seemed to agree about what debt-ridden and development-deprived economies in Latin America needed to prosper again, right? So he did not obviously, exactly as Mike said, he didn't intend it as a full list of everything that these countries needed to do. He didn't even, he only intended these as things about which there was a reasonable amount of agreement among people in Washington, right? And sensible people, of course, did disagree on a whole host of other things, right? So when I teach this course, I'm sorry about this, I teach this course, I actually start with this slide over here. And, I guess it answers or it tries to summarize what is the question that a whole lot of the panelists during the day actually spoke about is like, did the countries that do these 10 things, did they do better, right? And in general, you actually find that, I guess if you also had a 4th country over here, that was, say you had a country like Argentina, you would find that it probably didn't do many of these things. And then you go to Brazil, it did more, Mexico, it did a bit more, and Chile did a lot more, right? But there's always a big debate about this then, especially the students from Latin America and from Africa, they say, no, the Washington Consensus didn't work. It was a failure, and so on, right? So then we move on to the 2 or 3 weeks into the course, we actually move to this debate called the middle income trap, right? Will China become a high income economy? And when I do that, I actually talk a lot about Korea, right? I say, this is what happened to Taiwan. This is what happened to South Korea, and so on. And essentially, these 2 countries made a miracle in about 40 to 50 years, right? And then we start to get into what South Korea actually did, right? And essentially, you start to look at that, and at the end of that, I say that, that what it did do fairly early on was to secure property rights in both rural and urban areas, established early land reforms. It kept the budget deficit small. It did not it did not have too much recourse to the inflation tax. It didn't have very large debts, and so on, right? And then I go down further and I say, especially after 1997, 98, it did these other things too, right? And then at the end of it, by this time, the students have actually forgotten what the 10 things of the Washington Consensus look like. So then I go back to this slide over here, and I just include South Korea as well in there. And you see over here that South Korea has a lot of yeses, right? So it turns out that, if you do want to make this miracle, you have to do other things too, of course. But the things that John Williamson said that a lot of Washington agreed on, actually, those are the things that successful countries invariably did. And I think that's where the papers that we discussed, or that were presented and discussed today, basically, that's where they come out, right? But you'd still be surprised, David, how many people still think that the Washington Consensus is terrible. I've been in 2 board meetings, and the Washington Consensus is used as an expletive, right? Okay. Now, so what went wrong? So I think that, the way that I read it, especially after reading all of the things that John wrote and so on, is that I thought that he started out with what he called what was essentially a desirable set of economic policy reforms. And as Mike said, this was not supposed to be a growth or development strategy. It was not perhaps even the most important reforms. It was just the 10 policy instruments about whose proper deployment Washington can muster a reasonable degree of consensus. Okay, that's all it was, right? But then actually John made a mistake, Mike. He got into this debate about what was actually sufficient and so on. And he departed from that, and he tried to come up with this list, saying, oh, if you add this too, and so on. And he moved away from what people agreed on into things that people, lots of people disagreed on, right? And when you did the Growth Commission report, you tried to sort of look at the things about which people agreed on, but there were lots of you had to skin some cats, but there were many ways to skin those cats, etc. But I think that had he not done that, we would have been having a very different debate right now, because we would have still been trying to sort of, we would still try to sort of see is that, that it's not whether the Washington Consensus policy reforms were sensible back in the 1990s and the 2000s. I think they clearly were. And I think they actually still are. And here's where I think that we will actually, that it's not clear that if somebody tries to write a paper like John's, not about whether his 10 things are still relevant, but what are the 10 things about which people in Washington, sensible people, can muster a reasonable degree of consensus on, okay? And I have a feeling that they would not come up with those 10 things, Mike. Because, for example, I still remember I still remember the advice that the fund gave not so long ago. Spend what you can, but keep the receipts, right? I'm not sure if this is something that people in Washington can agree on, okay? So then I think it would really be good to actually see what would be that set of policy reforms about whose proper deployment Washington can muster a reasonable degree of consensus today, right? That would be a really nice exercise. And I think that somebody at Brookings or Peterson can actually compile this list. I think I could too, but I'd get fired. And I just started my job. So
well, it's a short-term job. So, if you start the list now, you can publish it.
Back to you.
Thank you very much. Celestine? Okay, we see you.
Okay, Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see everyone. I see Mike Spence. It's been a long time since our work in Bellagio. And nice to see Indomit, my former boss, was one of the most brilliant economists, but I'm going to take the risk to disagree with some of the things that he said. So, but he's used to me, so he's going to be indulgent. Well, very quickly, since we don't have a lot of time left, I mean, Michael Spence, I've known him for a long time. I thought he was high level, very sophisticated economist only. I've noticed in reading his paper that he's also a diplomat because in this paper, he praises the Washington Consensus, but he also has some very harsh criticism, which I think are valid. But the way he writes them, I mean, you would take the criticism as a compliment. So you should perhaps consider working at the UN, Mike, when you're done. Well, quickly, one of the points that both Michael and Indomit made is that, well, this was basically a set of guidelines. I think it was more than that, because that's the way it was sold. I went back and read a lot of documents that were published by both the IMF and the World Bank in 1990s, and basically during the 1990s. It was more than basic guideline. It was also the growth recipe, and they were not shy as stating it that way in official documents, including a decision by the board of directors of the IMF, saying, well, this is what you need to do to grow and even to reduce poverty. And they would put this. So you may think that they only consider it a set of guidelines. It was more than that. Now, the claim that it led to growth after at least the decade following it, I listened very carefully to Indomit, and I agree with almost everything he said, except he didn't mention Africa. Well, if there's a region in the world where there's been the Washington Consensus implementation more than any other, you know, almost 50 countries in Africa have gone through this, through IMF program. Well, it would be good to see what happened there. Not just, even after following the decade, immediately following the 90s. And I looked up the numbers. It's very easily, if you Google World Bank data on, let's say, GDP per capita, everything is there, including Sub-Saharan Africa. And you would see that Sub-Saharan Africa, the GDP per capita in 1990, let's say the year of the Washington Consensus, was only $1,300. And 10 years later, it was lower. It was $1,200, constant GDP per capita. So even that first decade didn't work. And now 3-4 decades later, well, it's very difficult to argue that it has worked, given these numbers. Now, I think one of the big problems with the consensus was this notion that there are conditions, preconditions that you need to satisfy before you can have a successful growth. That's kind of implicit in the whole reasoning. Well, if you look at the way economic growth has occurred throughout human history, no country has ever grown from a very good situation. It's always happened in bad situations. So that's also why the traditional recipe of improving the business environment, to me, is really not very realistic. No country will can improve its business environment enough and meet all the conditions listed in these big reports before they can grow. Certainly China in 1979 or 1980, or Costa Rica, and all these countries that have grown well, or Vietnam, the kind of things that have been happening to Vietnam the past 20 years. I mean, in very messy places where we bad business environment. So what have the Washington Consensus been missing? First, it has been trying to offer guidelines which may be reasonable for advanced economies to low-income countries. It has neglected structural differences. Joe Stiglitz and others have written theoretical work to explain, for instance, why high interest rates or even fiscal discipline, the number one recommendation may not be appropriate for low-income countries at a certain period of time in their history. Okay, Bolivia, Burundi, Bhutan, they are landlocked countries. They don't have to do what Switzerland is doing. They don't have to have the financial system that Switzerland has, just because they're all landlocked countries. And the Washington Consensus completely missed that. And one thing that Michael stressed in its paper, which I think is extremely important, is the issue of knowledge. In fact, the Washington Consensus took us in the 50s, when we were believing before Robert Solow that growth occurs when you have high savings, high investment, so you have to accumulate capital. Well, Solow explained and demonstrated that 70% of growth actually occurs elsewhere in what he called technology, and that Paul Romer later on opened the black box. But Washington Consensus completely forget that. You know, knowledge, technology transfer, all these things not to be found. And that's interesting because this institution called themselves knowledge institution, but they didn't apparently put knowledge in the list. And of course, the weakening of the states. And one kind of collateral damage, which is really very important, that the Washington Consensus prescription did, perhaps unwittingly, is the fact that it has been taken very seriously by rating agencies. And I can tell you, I have a friend of mine who works with a financial institution in Africa. We've been working on the cost, the financial cost on African countries of bad ratings from credit rating agencies, which are using the Washington Consensus prescription to give ratings to Africa. That leads to overinflated risk, which are very costly. There's these premium perceptions that they are charging all African countries. It's very, very costly. So there are many things that we have been going through because of the consensus, the Washington Consensus. To end, I know you have little time, David, but to end just 10 seconds. I think what we need now is a consensus, which I would call maybe the Bamako Consensus. Bamako is the capital city of Mali. Now pick some African country which is really, truly representative of these African countries that have followed IMF, World Bank, Washington Consensus policies for not 10, not 20, 30 years or more, and see what we can learn from that, what we've been missing, the missing elements, and how things need to be changed. And what we can learn from Costa Rica, from Vietnam, from China, which is not in the Washington Consensus. And there are many things in there. So, sorry, David.
No, thank you. Thank you. So I think we've learned I've learned a couple things today. One is that the Washington Consensus was poorly named, which hurt its reputation. I was going to suggest that we might have a Jakarta consensus or a Nairobi consensus, but Bamako is a good place as well. Secondly, my sense is that that there are quite a bit of disagreement as to what exactly the Washington Consensus was. Most of the people, Celestine is an exception, I think that it's been a set of necessary but not sufficient conditions. And everybody agrees that it was incomplete. It was incomplete in 1989 because it didn't deal enough with things like poverty and inequality and thoughtful discussions of the role of the state. And it's particularly ill-suited for an era, as Mike pointed out, where we have to deal with climate change, the fact that digital transformation is changing the comparative advantage of countries, and of course, the whole, what we learn from watching China and what role China will have. Mike, I wonder if I could, I want to be forward-looking in the 10 minutes we have left. So if you were convening the Bamako Consensus, and you wanted to adapt it to the issues we face today, not only those in 1989 and 90, what would you be advising that group to put on their list of things to, high up on the list of things to deal with? You're on mute, Mike.
Apologies. So we can all take a shot at that. On the substance, I think you have to immerse yourself in the global transformations that are underway. Now, I'm not going to go on at great length, but I mean, they're all of them are complex. They're all double-edged swords, right? You know, they have enormous potential, but you know, they pick any one. You know, digital technology has to be regulated because we didn't realize that when we started. You know, how many ways there are to misuse it. You know, how important the proper management and responsible management of data is. Take gene editing; it's probably the classic example. I mean, that may not sound like a development agenda, but you know, this is life sciences. Some of it's going to be in agriculture. It may very well be in a critical part of responding to climate change and food security and so on. So again, I mean, you know, it's not the whole story, but I think that's part of it. The second thing I think that, you know, Celestine was getting at and a number of others is that we just have to collectively work harder at integrating not our economies, but integrating our people. You know, we all have to be part of the networks that are part of the process of, you know, thinking our way through these things. And I fear that, you know, I mean, I don't know Mali very well, but there's lots of places in the world that are not sufficiently network connected to the knowledge network. To really, I think it's a very legitimate point Celestine made, that that's a legitimate area that would get elevated on the Bamako Consensus. So those are at least, those are two thoughts.
Let me ask you about one other. So I think at the time the Washington Consensus was conceived, generally economists and policymakers thought that globalization was a net plus and that it would increase productivity and we could take advantage of comparative advantage. And as you pointed out, there seems to be some questioning of that now for obvious reasons, the resiliency. Do you think that's going to change the way we recommend that countries function? Are we in a world where autarky is actually more of an attractive option than we thought 30 years ago?
No, autarky is fatal. I mean, you know, it's not only fatal for developing countries, it's fatal for small countries. Can you imagine Sweden trying to produce everything that they need? I mean, so
is there something in the deglobalization that is a minus that we need to worry about if we're moving?
Oh yeah, because it's fragmenting, and the international institutions so far on their back feet. You know, when we all know this, and we need to reconstruct a more realistic version of globalization that's respectful of, you know, things like resilience, responsive to dual use technologies and national security issues and so on. Very hard task. But the problem is, you know, we're not getting on with it right now. But I think, so we are going to see, you know, what you might call, David, partial deglobalization, but we can't go all the way down that road without, you know, literally catastrophic results.
Thanks. And Dermot, how would you can respond to Celestine if you like, but I want to know how a questioner asked, put this very well, like, so to what extent is the Washington Consensus still part of the IMF World Bank set of principles when it advises companies, and to what extent has it been discarded or somewhere in between, do you think?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this. You know, I think that despite ourselves, we have not been able to discard it. I mean, we've been trying to discard it, I think, you know, because you hear really, you know, I guess it's used like a bad thing and so on. And so you want to not like it. But, you know, we keep coming back to it. And I think that I'm sure that if you actually took a poll, like maybe 5 years back, you would probably find some people saying that the Washington Consensus was a failure and so on. If you talk to people today, after these fiscal deficits that have led to higher inflation rates and so on, I just ran some numbers and I found that for emerging market economies, if you ran bigger fiscal deficits, you were more likely to get a much sharper increase in inflation over the last year, year and a half or so. So, these are the kind of things that I bet if you actually took that poll today, David, I think there would be more support for the Washington Consensus policies than or there would be more agreement about these policies in Washington now than there were 5 years back. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. You might want, I'm not sure we can do this. Not sure that would apply to London at the moment, but maybe in Washington.
On that one, I was trying to sort of see that you ask people in the World Bank. I don't know about the IMF and US Treasury, but if you ask people at the World Bank that, what happens when you run big fiscal deficits and print too much money? What happens when you put quantitative restrictions on international trade? What happens when you use subsidies instead of cash transfers? What happens when a developing country runs up debt during times of low interest rates and then inflation rates go up in advanced economies? What happens when central banks start to worry more about climate risks and take their eyes off their knitting, which is inflation? I bet you'll find that the answers are much more in conformity with the consensus.
I think that part of the issue is, and Celestine kind of implied this, that there's a caricature of the Washington Consensus. Danny Roderick described it as get your macro balances in order, take the state out of business, and give markets free rein. And that's, of course, not exactly what John Williams said, but there are people who preach this, and that's given it a bad name. Celestine, I really appreciated your comments. And I'm curious, I want to ask you about one thing that we didn't talk about, which Mike Spence referred to, is that one thing where I think there has been a substantial shift is in what we think about capital flows and opening capital accounts, and the fund has changed its view a lot on the applicability of capital controls. And we certainly learned a lot during the 2008-9 financial crisis that was not at all envisioned when John Williamson convened that conference. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on where we are in the world of financial globalization and how we put that into the Bamako Consensus.
Yes, thank you. Well, on that particular question, I think that even the IMF has evolved on that. Thanks to Olivier Blanchard, who is not just a great economist, but he's like Michael Spence. He has great diplomatic skills, and he was able to bring some of his colleagues at the fund together to be a little more nuanced on that. Many developing countries in Latin America, in Africa, they suffer a lot from the reversal of financial flows that take place when there are changes in interest rates in advanced economies, especially portfolio flows, because they come in quickly and they leave quickly. And that create all kinds of exchange rate problems and competitiveness problems in these countries. Foreign direct investment has always been my preferred way of financing, of external financing flows, because they tend first to be more stable. They really express commitment, long-term commitment, except when they go to specific big projects. So I think that things are evolving positively there. There's more an intellectual consensus there than I. Well, on the question of what to do next, just in 20 seconds, I agree with what Michael said. I admire Indemnit's optimism. I think that we really need to do at least two things. First, encourage developing countries, low-income ones, to take targeting seriously. What I mean by targeting is selectivity. You cannot, when you have limited means, try to do everything. You need to find a way to be rational on the kind of things where you want to put your limited fiscal money into. You cannot develop 20, 50 different industries which are viable and competitive. Now, I'm not saying that the government needs to do this. No, but that conversation needs to be on the table. That's what successful economies have done, not just in Asia, but if you go back, look at Ireland, look at Italy, and use some of the institutions. Italy had the industrial district. Ireland was the first country to have a special economic zone, the modern type of special economic zone in 1959. Even though today people kind of discard that and say it's a Chinese thing. China just copied from some good ideas that were from elsewhere. So you go to any African country today where there are so many problems that cannot be resolved at once for all kinds of reasons, capacity, money, and so on. You need to have enclaves of excellence. And then the second and last point is we need to allow poor countries, so-called poor countries, because I don't think there's really any poor country out there, but so-called poor countries to contribute to the increase in global demand, because that's where, in the end, the action is. We need to improve global aggregate demand. And we are all happy today that China has become the powerhouse that it is, because I think the Chinese economy is almost a global public good, because that's a big market out there for all economies in the world to go sell there, like African countries to access the Chinese market. So how do we allow these low-income countries to have access? And I agree with some of the big points in the paper that trade is really where the action is. There's just not enough domestic demand for Mali, Burkina Faso, Algeria, Ethiopia, Cameroon, and so on, to grow sustainably and reduce poverty. So yeah,
Okay.
that's what I would say. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to end.
David,
Yes,
David,
please.
could I make one comment?
Please.
I want the real fast addition to the Bamako list. I think the shocks that the world is exposed to are particularly devastating for the lower income countries. And right now, I don't think the risk, diversification mechanisms, private insurance, domestic, social insurance, and international, things are A, adequate, and B, working. I mean,
You're talking about the shocks of like the inflation and pandemic, or
inflation, climate, pandemic, war, geopolitical tensions. I mean, you can convince yourself, if exaggerating slightly, that this looks like a perfect storm against, for some of these countries. So I know it's not a domestic development agenda, but I think on the international front, it's critical.
I was going to end by reading the closing words of your JEP paper, Mike. In the dark days of addressing the immediate threat of the pandemic, and to that we could end the war, add Ukraine and inflation and climate change, it is well to remember both that much has been accomplished, and indeed a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty, but also that there is much, much more to do. So that, I want to thank you for being so cooperative. It was a great conversation and an end to a great day. And I want to turn the virtual podium over to Peter Henry for some closing benediction.
Good to see you guys.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, David. And I don't know that this will be a benediction, but I will certainly try to very briefly just end on, I think, a justifiably hopeful note because of all that's been said and done and bring today together. So first of all, big thank you to Harvard and to Brookings for convening a really important conversation. A lot of really thoughtful, intelligent, and resourceful people have had a lot to say, so I won't try to summarize all those details, but let me just end by offering the following thoughts. I think that it's fair to say that we now have a lot of evidence on what drives growth. And the list of what's can be very country specific. But as Mike Spence pointed out, and I think the Growth Commission work stands up very well, stability, investment and saving, and openness to trade and ideas are essential ingredients to a pragmatic growth strategy that has a chance of working. And I think the big questions really, as we is how do we move from the what's of growth to the how, right? So, and the how really consists of two parts as I see it. the first part of how is thinking about those that list of sort of common threads to growth. And for any given country, thinking about, what are the constraints? What are the priorities? What are the elements of the what's of growth that are most likely to generate the most bang for the buck for a country given its very specific context? So that's one issue with how. The second issue with how, as I see it, is, okay, suppose you formulate in principle a growth strategy that's practical and that has the right prioritization in terms of driving growth. How do you execute it from a political economy standpoint? And this question's come up over and over again today. And there's some very important work. I'll just put a finger on it, and without going into detail, that's being done at the World Bank by Studi Kamani and some of her co-authors that asks the question, how do we think about government accountability and government capacity, essentially, to execute the how? And just tie that point into a point that was also made about resentment. So rather than having policies imposed from the outside by international institutions, which, as we've seen today, led to a great deal of resentment. In fact, probably a bit of sort of cutting off the nose to spite the face, in the sense of policies that were rejected when they really would have been helpful in the end, just because of the source from which they came. Rather than international institutions playing such a strong-handed role as they have in the past in trying to impose particular policies, the new line of thinking is that international institutions may have a bigger role to play in sort of enhancing accountability of governments to their own citizens. And I think that's going to be very critical in helping citizens within developing countries understand what it is they can do to hold their governments accountable, and whether the governments, in fact, are actually executing on the hows of growth, given the list of things that we have a pretty good sense of at this point are fundamental in some permutation, some combination to drive growth. And let me just end by saying why. Why does this matter? I was particularly pleased at the paper on Africa, because Africa, as we know, is the epicenter of population growth for the next several decades. And just to tie population growth in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa's population is growing in excess of 2% per year. And to tie population growth into a theme that Mike Spence put a finger on, which is critically important, is urbanization. We know that between 2000 and 2030, the number of people living in urban areas is going to double from 2 to 4 billion. And most of that is in Africa. And so getting the what's and the hows of growth right in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, is critical to future growth, the climate, all the issues that we care about, both from a prosperity perspective, an inclusiveness perspective, and a sustainability perspective. And a very tangible example of that would be to think about the discussion around platforms, right? So several points throughout the day, it was made very clear that the structural transformation that's underway in the global economy, with the move to sort of more platform economies that might eclipse the possibility of having anything looking like manufacturing-led, labor-intensive growth in developing countries. Very critical to that is going to be electricity. You can't have platform economies without reliable electricity. So again, think about Sub-Saharan Africa. What this tells us is that infrastructure is going to be central to driving growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, efficient investment in infrastructure. Well, efficient investment in infrastructure is very consistent with the view that's been expressed throughout the day that efficient public investment has to play a central role in driving growth in the developing world. And the question is, how do you get efficient public investment? Well, that again gets to the how. So let me end there by saying that I think we've had a very productive discussion today. The facts are there for all to digest and to consider. And I do indeed think that the future is hopeful if we can get beyond this issue of kind of what do we call, how do we label the central kind of common threads of growth, and really focus our attention on how countries can put together pragmatic growth strategies and how we can better help citizens in developing countries hold their governments accountable for the kinds of investments and market support that are needed to happen in order to drive growth. And it's fundamental because millions and billions of people are depending on the execution of reliable, productive, inclusive, and sustainable growth strategies. So let me end there. And thank you everybody for participating, all participants, all discussants, all those who took time to send in questions, and again, to Brookings and Harvard.